Ever get that feeling? Like you really want to wrap your head around something complex, but without, totally overloading your brain. That's what we're all about here, digging deep into the research, finding those nuggets of wisdom that really matter, and, well, bringing it all to you. And today, we're taking on how students become those awesome, self-directed learners. It's kind of a big deal in education, and there's so much interesting research out there.
It is. Self-regulated learning, or SRL as we like to call it in the biz, is basically all about taking the reins of your own learning. It's about planning out what you got to learn, keeping tabs on how you're doing and switching things up if you need to learn better. Think of it as like being the captain of your own learning ship. You chart the course, you adjust the sails, you make sure you're heading in the right direction, and the research is pretty clear. SRL is tied to better learning habits, you get better results, and you're more motivated. And this is true for all ages in all kinds of learning settings.
Right. Like, it doesn't matter if you're just starting out or you've been at it for years. SRL matters.
Hmm.
So for a while, a lot of the research focused on, directly teaching students these skills. But lately, there's been a shift. Researchers are really digging into how teachers can best support students in becoming self-regulated. So what we're doing today is diving into how teachers try to help students develop SRL. There's the direct approach, where they actually teach specific strategies. And then there's the more indirect way, where they create a learning environment that kind of nudges students towards self-regulation. And our main source is a bunch of studies where researchers went right into the classroom and observed what was actually happening.
Yeah, those classroom observations, they're like gold,
Uh,
because we get to see teachers in action doing their thing. It's not just theory, it's the real deal. Of course, we got to remember we're only seeing what's on the surface. We don't know exactly what's going on in a teacher's head. But still, just by looking at these observations, we start to see patterns. We see how SRL is being tackled, or maybe, and this is the surprising part, how it's not being tackled at all.
exactly. It's not always what you'd expect. So we're going to break down these two main ways teachers try to activate SRL. Direct strategy instruction, that's where teachers specifically teach students like techniques for learning, and indirect activation, where the learning environment itself encourages students to take charge. And like we hinted at, some of what these classroom observations show is pretty unexpected. So let's start with that first approach, teachers directly teaching learning strategies.
Okay, direct strategy instruction. What it's all about is giving students those tools, those specific methods to improve their learning. You can think of it as like uh, building their learning toolkit, giving them different tools for different jobs. And research has shown time and time again that when students get that explicit training in these strategies, they actually get better at learning on their own. So it could be teaching them how to plan out an assignment, how to check if they really get something, or how to reflect on what they've learned.
Makes sense, right? But one of the big things researchers have found is that this strategy instruction, it works best when it's woven right into the subject they're learning.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be some separate lesson on how to learn that's totally disconnected from, say, solving a math problem or understanding a history chapter. This idea of embedded instruction, it helps students see exactly how to use these strategies within the context of a specific task. It's like showing them, hey, here's the right tool for this job. Use it now.
You got it. And the research on direct strategy instruction, well, it's kind of taken a few different routes. Some studies have focused on giving teachers those ready-made materials they can use in class to train students in using strategies. And these have been pretty successful, showing that when teachers have the right resources, they can really help students learn these important SRL skills. Then you've got another line of research that looks at training teachers who are already out there, working in schools on how to better promote SRL with their students. The idea is to help these teachers figure out how to integrate SRL support into their regular lessons. And again, these teacher training studies have shown some really good outcomes.
That's awesome. So they're not just thrown in the deep end. They get the support they need. And then what's the third path?
Right. The third one focuses on bringing SRL into teacher training programs, for those folks who are just starting out on their teaching journey. The goal is to get them thinking about SRL and how to encourage it right from the beginning, both for their own learning as new teachers and then for when they're out there teaching. So basically building SRL awareness into the very foundation of their teaching careers.
Makes sense, right? Get them thinking about it early on.
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about teaching these strategies, it sounds like there are, well, different levels of how clear and direct a teacher can be. The
Right.
research mentions different levels of explicitness. Yeah.
Yeah, there are. Way back in 1981, Brown and some other researchers, they came up with a really helpful way to think about these levels. So at the most basic level, you've got what they called blind training. This is where students are encouraged to use a strategy, but they're not really told why they're doing it, when it might be helpful, or even that it is a specific strategy. It's almost like subtly guiding them towards a certain behavior. They might use the strategy for a bit, but it doesn't really stick, and they don't know how to use it in different situations.
So they're doing it, but they don't really understand why or when else it might be useful. It's like using a special knife,
Yeah.
without knowing that it's specifically designed for slicing tomatoes.
Perfect analogy. Then the next level up is informed training. Here, students are not only encouraged to use a strategy, but they're also told why it's good for them, why it's helpful. And understanding that reasoning, well, it should help them perform better and make them more likely to use the strategy again in similar situations.
Okay, so now they know the tomato knife, it's got that serrated edge that lets you slice without squashing.
Exactly. And then the most complete level is self-control training. This one combines the informed training, so they know the why, with explicit instruction on how to manage, monitor, check, and evaluate how they're using the strategy. And this level, it's seen as the most effective because it really puts students in the driver's seat. They own their learning, and they're more likely to be able to use that strategy in all sorts of new situations. It's like they understand the tool, they know how to use it well, and they know how to tell if it's working.
Makes sense. It's like giving them the whole picture, what to do, when to do it, why it's helpful, and how to do it. I think Veenman called this the WWWNH rule, right?
You got it. What to do, when, why, and how. This explicit approach is super important for helping students develop what we call metacognitive knowledge, which is basically knowledge about how they think and learn. It's about understanding their own learning processes and knowing about the strategies themselves.
So it's like making the invisible visible, helping them see how their own learning actually works. And this explicit instruction is different from what we call implicit instruction, right?
You bet. Implicit instruction can be helpful, but it usually works best after students have gotten that explicit training in self-regulation strategies.
Right.
Once they've got that basic understanding down, then those subtle cues, those little hints and modeling from the teacher, they can really reinforce those skills. So you've got things like implicit demonstration, where a teacher uses a strategy without actually naming it, or implicit explanation, where a student might read about a strategy, but the teacher doesn't directly present it. And then there's the implicit call, where the teacher kind of gently nudges the student to use a certain strategy without actually, explicitly telling them to. And even implicit asking, where the task itself kind of points towards a specific strategy, but the teacher doesn't directly question its use. All of these can be useful, but they often rely on that initial groundwork, that explicit teaching.
All right, so you got to know what a tomato is before you can pick up on the fact that someone's cutting it in a way that suggests they're using a special tomato knife. Yeah. Now, it sounds like just telling students about strategies isn't the whole story.
Oh, no, it's definitely not the whole story. Research has shown that just instructing students in learning strategies, it doesn't magically make them better learners or more motivated to use those strategies. They need feedback on how they're doing, how they're actually using the strategies. Zimmerman has done a lot of work on that. And they need to develop that metacognitive knowledge, like we talked about, understanding those strategies and thinking about why they're beneficial. Schra and Veenman have talked about this too. And interestingly, those studies that look at tons of other studies, meta-analyses, they've found that when students are encouraged to reflect on how they use those metacognitive strategies, well, the positive effects of strategy training are even stronger.
So the moment of reflection, it's key. It's not just knowing how to use the tool. It's about thinking about when it was helpful and why.
Exactly. That's thinking about thinking, right?
Yeah.
And McCombs and Marzano, they talked about two important things involved in this. First, learners need to actually get good at using the strategy, right? They need to develop that metacognitive knowledge, knowing how to use it and when it works best. And second, they need that drive, that motivation to actually use SRO, putting in the effort to use these strategies because they understand it'll save them time and help them get better results. Once they've got that knowledge and that motivation, then they need those learning situations where they can actually use their SRL skills.
Okay, so that's the theory behind teaching SRL strategies. But what about the reality? What do we see when we actually look into classrooms? Are teachers actually doing this direct strategy instruction? It sounds like the findings might be a little surprising.
They are, often. A lot of those classroom observation studies, they found surprisingly low levels of direct strategy instruction happening.
For example?
Well, take a study from way back in 1992 by Moyley and her colleagues. They watched a whole bunch of elementary school teachers, and guess what? They found that teachers only suggested using a learning strategy in about 2% of the time they were observed teaching. And when they looked specifically at metacognitive strategies and explaining the why, that number dropped to less than 1%. Now, they did find some differences based on what grade the teacher was teaching, but overall, despite all the evidence showing how beneficial direct strategy instruction is, it seems it wasn't happening that much.
2%. Wow, that's really low, especially for something that's supposed to be so important for learning. What about older students, like middle schoolers? Was it any different for them?
Not really. Hammond and his team did a similar study in the year 2000, but with middle school teachers. They used a similar method for keeping track of what they were seeing as Moley's study, and the results were pretty much the same. Only about 2% of the instruction involved teachers suggesting learning strategies. And they noticed that there was very little emphasis on metacognitive strategies in particular, and even less on strategies for managing time. So that pattern of low direct strategy instruction, it seemed to be continuing as students got older.
So basically not much direct strategy instruction in elementary or middle school. What about high school? Any change there?
Sadly, no. Wienman and his team, they observed high school classrooms in 2009, and the same pattern continued. They found that only around 4% of the teaching time was spent on directly teaching metacognitive strategies. And another interesting thing, when it did happen, it was more focused on the beginning stages, like getting started and planning. The really important parts, like checking your understanding and reflecting on what you learned, those were kind of being neglected. It's almost like those later stages of self-regulation, they were getting overlooked.
It's like the emphasis is on making the plan, not so much on checking if the plan worked or, learning from the experience. And these are all individual studies. Has there been any, larger look at this across many classrooms?
Yeah, there has. Zapita and colleagues in 2019, they took a look at a huge chunk of data from the METT study, the Measures of Effective Teaching study. And what they found, it kind of mirrored those earlier studies. They saw that only about 7% of what teachers were saying in the classroom had anything to do with metacognition, that thinking about thinking stuff. And this was more likely to happen when they were teaching the whole class, and again, it was more about monitoring progress, not so much about planning. They also noticed that teachers talked more about students knowing their own strengths and weaknesses as learners, rather than teaching specific strategies or when to use them. So even on a larger scale, directly teaching those concrete metacognitive strategies, it doesn't seem to be a big part of what's happening in classrooms.
So even in a large study, the results are the same. The direct teaching of specific metacognitive strategies is just not very common. What about those studies that looked at individual classrooms really closely? Did those show anything different?
There was a very detailed study in 2010 by DePapa and his team. They observed two sixth-grade math classrooms over a long period, very in-depth. And what they found was that both teachers almost completely skipped over the planning stage of problem solving and explaining the how and why of using a particular strategy. They did see some differences in how often the two teachers talked about and used a certain problem-solving approach. And this seemed to match what the teachers themselves believed and what their students reported. But overall, that focus on planning and why you'd use a strategy, it was still largely absent.
Interesting that even in a more focused study, the lack of emphasis on planning and explaining strategies is still there. And one last study on direct instruction.
Yeah, Spruth and Ball in 2015, they observed a mix of elementary and high school teachers, and they found that when teachers did try to get students to self-regulate, it mostly happened during the working phase, while students were actually doing the task and checking their progress. Very little happened during the planning stage or when they were reflecting on what they learned. And overall, they also found pretty low levels of direct teaching of those metacognitive strategies. So the pattern seems pretty clear. Direct, explicit instruction in how to think about learning, it's not a common thing in classrooms, especially when it comes to planning and understanding why a certain strategy is useful. This really points to a potential gap between what research says is effective and what's actually happening in the real world. So let's switch gears now and look at that second way teachers try to encourage self-regulated learning indirectly through the learning environment.
Okay, so indirect activation of SRL. This is all about how teachers can set up the learning environment in a way that almost naturally leads students to become more self-regulating. It's like the classroom and the tasks themselves are structured in a way that requires students to take more responsibility for their own learning.
Right. It fits really well with those ideas about learning, where students aren't just passive recipients of information, they're active builders of their own knowledge. It's
Yeah.
called constructivism. And this idea of providing these kinds of learning environments, it's seen as super important for helping students become those awesome, self-regulated learners.
And DeCourte and colleagues back in 2004, they came up with a way to think about these types of learning environments, right? What were those key elements they identified?
They did. They outlined four important aspects. The first one is activating prior knowledge and creating cognitive conflict. This means getting students to think about what they already know and then throwing them a curveball, presenting them with situations that challenge their current understanding, forcing them to dig deeper. The second is learning in context. That's all about making learning relevant, connecting it to real-world situations. The third element is cooperative learning, where students work together, share ideas, bounce things off each other, and learn from one another. And finally, there's self-directed learning. This is where students get more independence. They might get to choose tasks, work at their own pace, and even have a say in how they'll be assessed.
So it's about designing those tasks and structuring the classroom in a way that really encourages students to get involved, to be active participants, and really take ownership of their learning. And does the research suggest that this actually makes a difference?
It does. Studies have shown that these elements can actually distinguish classrooms that are really good at supporting SRL from those that aren't. For example, Butler and his colleagues in 2013, they found that when teachers used more of those inquiry-based and problem-solving approaches, the ones that really push students to be independent, they saw improvements in student achievement. So it seems like these kinds of learning environments, they can help students learn both the content and how to learn it.
That's great. So it's not just about the what, it's about the how. And it sounds like this idea of indirectly encouraging SRL, it's also connected to broader ideas about what makes teaching effective in general.
Absolutely. Things like Hamre and Pianta's class framework, which looks at how the classroom is organized, the emotional support teachers give, and their instructional support. Or Klein and his colleagues' three basic dimensions of teaching quality, which are managing the classroom effectively, supporting students, and cognitively activating them. All of these relate to creating that environment where SRL can thrive. So, for example, effective classroom management, that creates a focused and stable setting, which is crucial for students to really engage in self-regulated learning. Supporting students, giving them that scaffolding when they need it, that helps guide them as they take on more responsibility. And then cognitively activating students, getting them to think deeply and build on what they already know, that aligns perfectly with those active learning elements we talked about.
So good teaching practices in general, they kind of set the stage for indirectly encouraging SRL. And Zimmerman's ideas about those different levels of support teachers can provide for self-regulation, those fit in here too, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Zimmerman described four levels: observation, emulation, self-control, and self-regulation. At the observation level, the teacher is very much in charge, demonstrating and explaining their own learning processes. Then you've got emulation, where students try to follow that model and the teacher provides support and feedback. As students move to self-control, they start practicing more on their own, and the teacher creates learning situations that allow them to gradually take over. And finally, at the self-regulation level, students are independently monitoring and adjusting their learning, and the teacher steps back, becoming more of a resource if needed. So the main theme here is that gradual decrease in teacher control as students become more independent learners.
It's like slowly letting go of the bike as the person learns to ride, right? Giving
Oh.
them that space to find their balance. And as we talked about before, this demonstrating and supporting, it can be implicit or explicit, depending on whether those thinking processes are directly addressed.
Exactly. A teacher might show a good way to solve a problem, but it's only really focused on SRL if they also explain why they chose that method, what they were thinking as they worked through it, and encourage students to think about their own approaches. It's also important to remember that while these student-centered environments are great, they do need some guidance, especially for students who are just starting to develop their self-regulation skills. If a learning situation is too complex or too unstructured, it can actually make it harder for students to learn. Kirshner and his colleagues, they've done some work on that. Research suggests that providing clear guidance within these active learning environments, like Wijnia and her team found, can make them way more effective.
Right. You can't just throw someone in the deep end and expect them to learn to swim without any instruction or support.
Hmm.
So what do these classroom observations tell us about how often teachers are actually creating these indirectly supportive environments? Are they doing it?
Perry and her colleagues, they've done some really interesting work on this, especially looking at writing instruction in elementary school. In a couple of studies, one from 1998 and another from 2002, they found that those classrooms where students were given more complex tasks, tasks that really made them think, where they had some control over their learning, where they got helpful support from the teacher, and where they understood how their work could be evaluated, those tended to be the environments where students showed more self-regulation. Their research suggested that the level of challenge in the tasks teachers set, well, that's a big predictor of how many chances students get to actually practice self-regulated learning.
So tasks that require thinking and decision-making, they seem to be a key part of indirectly encouraging SRL. What about with younger kids, like kindergartners?
Perry and Van de Kamp, they did a study in 2000 looking at kindergarten and early elementary classrooms. They found some teachers who were able to create environments that were both highly structured and open for exploration. These teachers, they gave students choices, they gave them challenging activities, but they were also really good at giving clear instructions and providing that scaffolding when needed. It shows that structure and independence don't have to be at odds with each other.
It's all about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
And Perry's work, it also looked at helping teachers who are still training, right?
They did in 2006. And they found that a lot of these pre-service teachers, they were able to learn how to design those tasks and teaching methods that would encourage SRL. Again, the complexity of the task was a strong predictor of how well it would foster self-regulation.
So even teachers who are just starting out, they can learn to create these kinds of environments. That's encouraging. Now, what about older students? Did Bolho's and Votan's observations in high schools show similar ways of indirectly encouraging SRL?
Their study from 2001, it actually showed an interesting contrast. They observed that students spent a good chunk of time, over 40%, working independently. But only a tiny amount of time, about 5%, was dedicated to what they called process-oriented teaching. This included things like explaining learning processes, asking students about how they learn, giving them feedback on their learning, and directly teaching SRL strategies. And their conclusion was pretty eye-opening. It seems that teachers often expect students to work independently without actually teaching them how to manage that independence effectively. So the environment might be set up to require self-regulation, but that explicit instruction on how to do it well, that's often missing. This really brings us back to how those direct and indirect approaches work together. It seems like neither one on its own might be enough.
Exactly. It's about finding that synergy. And there have been studies that looked at both approaches at the same time, right?
Yeah, like Kistner and colleagues' 2010 reanalysis of the TIMS video data. What did they find?
Well, they found that even when teachers did talk about learning strategies, most of the time it was focused on those cognitive strategies, the thinking skills you need for the task itself. Only a small portion was about metacognitive strategies, the ones about managing your own learning. So even when strategies are mentioned, it's often more about the what to think rather than the how to manage the thinking process.
Exactly. And Digna Van Ewijk and her team, they observed 7th grade math classrooms in 2013, looking at both direct teaching of strategies and the learning environment. Their findings lined up with Kistner's. Teachers talked way more about cognitive strategies than metacognitive ones. They also looked at how the learning environment related to student outcomes, and the results were a bit mixed, suggesting that just having a supportive environment doesn't automatically lead to better results unless there's something else going on.
Mixed results. So just setting up what looks like a good learning environment might not be enough. Students need the skills to actually take advantage of it. This leads to a really important question. How does what teachers actually do in the classroom, in terms of supporting SRL, relate to how well students actually learn and what they achieve? Does it even matter?
Right. This is where we see if all this effort is actually paying off. And several of the studies we've talked about, they also looked at student outcomes to see if there was a connection. Remember that second study by Molly and her colleagues in 1992? They found that for those students who weren't doing so well initially, those low and moderate achievers, having teachers who often suggested learning strategies actually helped them do better on a memory task. But this wasn't true for the students who were already high achievers. So it suggests that direct strategy instruction, it might be especially helpful for those who are struggling.
That's a really interesting point,
Mhm.
that those who need the most help might benefit the most from that direct guidance.
Exactly. And Hammond and his team, their 2000 study, they found a positive connection between teachers who provided a lot of general learning guidance, which included suggesting strategies, and students reporting that they used more learning strategies themselves. But here's the thing. They didn't find a direct link between what the researchers observed teachers doing and whether students specifically said they used more of those higher level metacognitive strategies. So students might say they're using more strategies when their teachers talk about learning in general, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're using more of those self-monitoring and self-evaluating skills.
That's an important distinction. It's not just about using any strategy, it's about using the right ones at the right time.
Hmm.
What about Zapita and her team's 2019 study, the one where they compared classrooms where students showed a lot of conceptual growth with those where they didn't?
They found that there were differences in how teachers supported metacognitive strategies. Teachers in those high-growth classrooms, they emphasized monitoring and evaluating progress more. They also noticed differences in the overall instructional approach those teachers used. But it's important to remember that this study shows a connection, a correlation, but it doesn't prove that the teacher's approach caused the higher growth.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Always important to keep that in mind. But the patterns are still interesting. What about Kistner and colleagues' 2010 study where they reanalyzed the TIMSS, the one where they looked at how much students learned?
They found a significant correlation between how much students learned in math and whether their teachers provided explicit strategy instruction. But here's the interesting part. They didn't find that same link with implicit strategy instruction. So again, it points to the importance of making those learning strategies clear and understandable for students.
So it seems like directly and clearly teaching those learning strategies can have a real impact on student learning. And what about the indirect approach, the learning environment? Did Dignith Vanevi and her team find any connection between that and student outcomes?
Yeah, they did. They found that when teachers really focused on creating those learning experiences where the learning was situated in a meaningful context, what they called situated learning, it actually predicted students' self-regulation skills and their achievement in a positive way. So that supports the idea that those active real-world learning environments, they can be really beneficial. It seems like we're starting to get a clearer picture, although it's still complex, of how what teachers do relates to how students learn. Now, let's shift gears a bit and think about what might influence how teachers approach supporting SRL in the first place. What characteristics of teachers might predict how they teach these skills?
Yeah, that's a great question. If we can understand what drives those choices teachers make, then we can start thinking about how to better support them. Remember DePape and his team's 2010 study where they interviewed those two sixth-grade math teachers? Well, their interviews revealed that if the teachers believed in a structured approach to problem solving, if they thought it was useful, they were more likely to actually teach strategies in that structured way. And this lined up with what the researchers actually observed in the classrooms.
So, a teacher's belief in a structured approach influences how they teach. Makes sense. What other beliefs might play a role?
Well, Quistner and colleagues, in their 2015 study, they found that teachers who leaned more towards constructivist beliefs, meaning they see learning as an active process where students build their own understanding, those teachers tended to focus more on teaching those metacognitive planning strategies in their lessons. It's an interesting link, suggesting that a belief in active learning might lead teachers to emphasize those early stages of self-regulation.
Hmm, that's subtle, but it could be important. What about Pally and colleagues' 2007 analysis of the TIMSS data? They looked at constructivist beliefs as well, didn't they?
They did. They found a connection between teachers who reported having constructivist beliefs and giving students opportunities to do independent problem solving. But here's the thing. They didn't find a direct link between those beliefs and how much those teachers said they promoted SRL specifically. So it might be that teachers see independent work as part of their overall philosophy of learning, but they don't necessarily see it as directly connected to those specific skills of self-regulated learning.
That's a key distinction. It seems like teachers' general ideas about learning don't always translate directly into specific actions that support SRL. And this idea, it's further supported by Spruce and Bowles' findings in 2015, right?
Exactly. They found a mismatch. Teachers said they believed SRL was important, but their actual knowledge about it and how much they promoted it in their classrooms, well, it didn't match up. So teachers might value SRL in theory, but they might not have the specific knowledge or skills to effectively help students develop it. The intention is there, but the practical understanding of how to do it, that might be missing.
And Dignith and Butner's study in 2018, it kind of echoed this, didn't it?
Yeah, they also found that teachers' beliefs about how important SRL was, they weren't really reflected in how much they were actually observed to promote it, or even in how much they said they promoted it. And a lot of teachers struggled to even explain what metacognitive strategies were, even though they said they valued SRL. This really highlights that gap between what teachers believe and what actually happens in the classroom.
It seems like teachers might have this positive view of self-regulated learning, but they might lack a clear understanding of what it really involves and how to actually help their students develop those skills. So let's sit back for a second and look at the big picture. What have we learned from all this research and where do we go from here? What are the big questions that still need to be answered?
Okay, so big picture. If we look at all the research we've discussed, the main takeaway from these classroom observations is that teachers tend to focus more on those cognitive strategies, the what of learning, with not much explicit teaching of metacognitive strategies, the how and why of learning. And when those metacognitive strategies are mentioned, it's often not happening during that crucial planning stage. So there's a clear difference between what research suggests is effective, that explicit instruction on when, how, and why to use learning strategies, and what we're actually seeing in classrooms.
And while it seems like a lot of teachers are setting up learning environments that should, in theory, require students to be more self-regulating, that clear guidance on how to actually manage that independence, well, it seems to be missing a lot of the time. It's like giving someone all the ingredients for a recipe, but not telling them how to put it all together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we do have some promising initial evidence suggesting that clearly teaching those learning strategies can lead to better results for students, which emphasizes the importance of that direct instruction piece. And the link between what teachers believe about learning and what they actually do in the classroom when it comes to SRL, well, that seems to be more complex and not always super strong. It shows that just believing in SRL isn't enough to ensure it's being taught effectively.
So where do we go from here? What are the big questions that still need answers?
There's a lot to explore. First off, we need more head-to-head comparisons, ideally through those well-designed experiments. We need to really tease out the specific effects of directly teaching strategies versus indirectly encouraging SRL through the environment. And we need to connect what we know about effective teaching practices in general with the specific ways to support SRL. How do things like good classroom management and cognitively activating students affect their self-regulation?
Great point. We need to see how SRL fits into that bigger picture of good teaching. What else should researchers be looking at?
We need to dig deep into how different teacher characteristics influence their ability to support students into becoming self-regulated learners. What do they know about SRL? What are their beliefs about how it develops and how important it is? How confident do they feel in teaching it? And even their own skills as self-regulated learners. Understanding all of this is super important for designing more effective teacher training programs.
It also sounds like we need to tackle some of the potential misunderstandings that teachers might have about teaching SRL.
Absolutely. For example, that idea that directly teaching strategies somehow clashes with those active learning approaches. Research needs to show clearly that these can work together and that clear guidance can actually make those active learning environments more effective. And we need to dig deeper into teachers' self-efficacy, that belief in their own ability to teach SRL, because it seems like that plays a huge role.
And in terms of preparing teachers, it seems like SRL needs